trust will start working to hurt you rather than to help you. Verse 1 says, many are they who rise up against me. David says, this is military language. David was outnumbered and the opposition is growing, and the nature of picking sides in a situation like this is when you think it's going to be war, the side with more people tends to be more appealing. And so more and more people are choosing Absalom's side or switching allegiances from David to Absalom and taking a stand against David. And David responded by asking the Lord to look, see what my enemies are doing. But second, he asked the Lord, do you hear what my enemies are saying? The pain that David felt about what these enemies were doing to him gets dialed up significantly when he hears what they're saying about him. In verse 2, David complains, many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. Y'all, I have seen people go through things that I thought were so bad that only God could help them. I have gone through situations where it was so bad could admit only God could help me, but I have never seen someone go through something that I thought was so bad that not even God could help them. That's what folks, though, were saying about David. There's no help for him in God. In fact, we have some of this event recorded. One particular little weasel named Shimei came running out while David was fleeing from Jerusalem. Shimei came running out just to mock him. Now, he did this in a great deal of boldness because there was what was called a wadi in between Shimei and David. In other words, a dried up creek where you couldn't just cross over. So he was on one side yelling at David and his company on the other side. 2 Samuel 16 verse 8, he's shouting, the Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. Now you are caught in your own evil because you were a bloodthirsty man. In other words, David, you wretch, you stole the kingdom from Saul. Now God's going to take it from you. Everything that's happening here is exactly what you deserve. You can't be in a worse situation than to think that even God won't help you because God is against you. But the first verses of this psalm tell us David knows that God is more than able to help. And yet the people were telling him that God was not going to help. David's circumstances had led outsiders to conclude that God had essentially turned his back on David. And y'all, be careful how I say this. This was not an entirely illogical conclusion. When the people looked at David's life, there's some understanding of how they could reach the conclusion they did. Why was David experiencing the things that he was? Well, David had committed adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. When he repented of this, ultimately God forgave him, but David still had to face the consequences for his sin. 2 Samuel 12, verse 11, the Lord says, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. Right? David was experiencing the weight of that judgment from God through Absalom's insurrection. And that caused people to conclude that God had essentially forsaken David and would not help him. Now, there's an important warning here in David's experience. The Lord is kind and good to forgive sin, but he may not remove the consequences of those sins. Do not presume to continue in sin saying, well, it's fine, God will forgive me because God is forgiving. Listen, God is also just. You can be forgiven and still deal with the consequences of your sin for years to come. Not only is Absalom's revolt an example of this, but I mentioned earlier David's advisor Ahithophel had turned against him. Ahithophel just happened to have a granddaughter named Bathsheba. In other words, God grants forgiveness and restores a relationship with God, but you might still face the consequences of your sin in relationship to others. Psalm 3 warns us that the scars of our sin may remain even after the sin itself is forgiven. But this psalm should also be a warning to us not to commit spiritual malpractice by misdiagnosing other people's troubles. Don't you go looking at other people and say, oh, everything they're dealing with is because God has turned his back on them. You're presuming to know more than you do. Those who witnessed David's situation concluded there was no help for him in God, and clearly those people are wrong. Very wisely, David refused to believe their report. Rather than drawing false conclusions from what the people were doing and what the people were saying, David simply pours his heart out to God. Second, David trusts the Lord with his burdens. In verses 3 through 6, David shifts all of his focus to God and away from his enemies. This is the only sure way to face the overwhelming battles of life. You know, when you stare at your enemies or stare at your troubles or get preoccupied with the situation that you're in, all of those things will seem to grow in size and appear overwhelming. But when you turn your thoughts to God, everything shrinks before the greatness of God. And so that's what David does. He does not respond to the threats of his enemies by sulking. He gets theological. There are two ways David trusted the Lord with his burdens. First, he trusted God to be righteous in his attributes. The people had concluded that the Lord had forsaken David, and David responds defiantly in verse 3. He says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head." Look at verse 3 and note the personal terms in which David describes God. He is a shield for me. He is my glory. He is the lifter of my head. These are not words of somebody who's been forsaken by God. They're the testimony of someone who has a personal relationship with the Lord. I'm sure you know a shield is a military term. A warrior would hold the shield in one hand and go into battle in order to deflect the blows of the enemy as he fought with one hand. But the problem with the shield is it offers limited protection. Right? Whichever arm, whichever hand you put it in, you might be able to block things on that side, but there's a whole lot of the rest of you that's open. David here, though, says that God is a shield for me, and it would probably be better translated from the Hebrew as he is a shield about me or a shield around me. The idea is that God is a shield that covers me on every side. We have complete protection in God. He says that God is his glory. The word glory here typically refers to the glory of God, but when it's used in reference to humans, it speaks of dignity and honor. David is saying that his sense of self-identity is rooted in who God is, not who he is. And this is good because David has been banished from the throne. He's been exiled from the city by his own son. David sees the honor that he had is not in the king's throne or in the king's city or in the king's subjects or the king's armies or the king's treasury. Even with all of that left behind, David can say, here is